Great. So I'm Frank Felder with the Rutgers Energy Institute. Today we have Seth Hulkower. I've known Seth for a long time. He was the Chief Operating Officer at the Long Island Power Authority, I think through 2008. I may not got my dates exactly right, 2007.
2007. I left at the end of 2007, actually.
Okay. He's been involved a lot with New Jersey and New York, and that's the basis of today's presentation. You were on the review committee for the 2008 Energy Master Plan, which seems like a long time ago. And then over the years, Seth and I have done various projects together. Seth's background is as an engineer, a utility executive, and as an economist in the power sector, both on building, developing power plants, all the way through running a major distribution company. So with that, I'll turn it over to Seth. He'll go about 35, 40 minutes, then we'll have Q&A, and we'll take it from there. And just as a reminder, I am recording this. So Seth, thank you for doing this, and let's get started.
Thanks, Frank, and good afternoon to everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity from Rutgers Energy Institute to make this presentation today to talk about New York State's energy strategy. This work is based on a project that I did recently for the New York Citizens Budget Commission, which is one of the oldest and I think best established good government organizations in the country. And it started with a conversation from them. They said, what's this reforming the energy vision thing that the New York Public Service Commission is doing? And what's it mean for electric customers? And like any good consultant, I immediately expanded and I said, looking at REV by itself isn't a sufficient question. You've got to look at how REV fits into the energy policy strategy for the state. And so we agreed on that, and that was the initial project. There was actually a big report that was published. If you'd like to read it, you can go to my website, and I'll have the website at the end of the presentation, and you find it under News and Publications. As Frank mentioned, my training is both as an engineer and an economist, and I see a real connection between those two. The connection is that both disciplines focus on questions of efficiency. How can we do the most with the least? And that's going to be a through line of my analysis. And for me, that also means, especially looking at it from the economist standpoint, how do we get the most efficient price signals into the market to encourage businesses, organizations, consumers to form the behavior that we want in the most efficient way. So with that, let's get into the presentation. This statement shouldn't be controversial. I don't think it's controversial for this audience, but I wanted to make my position clear on this. Climate change is an existential crisis. Keep that in mind while you're listening to me providing an overview of New York's energy policy and a critique of that energy policy. This slide shouldn't be of any surprise to anybody, especially for the folks from the Center for Energy Economics and Environmental Policy. The difference is how it's applied from one jurisdiction to another, placing different emphasis on one, two, or all three of these elements. Right now, for instance, the federal government is putting a very heavy emphasis on energy availability, making sure that we can get energy from anywhere. We just saw that the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge was opened up. I recently spoke with some folks in Indiana concerning an energy policy study that they were interested in doing. And what motivated them was that they felt that in the 70s and 80s, the state had a very serious competitive edge against the rest of the country, making their manufacturing industries more competitive. And they feel that they had lost that. And they wanted to understand what that was, why it happened, and what they could do to ameliorate that and to give Indiana its competitive edge in industrial production again. So that's how different jurisdictions look at it. New York's energy policy is primarily an environmental policy. It's all about cutting the carbon. The actual focus is on greenhouse gas emissions. And so, but New York's policy is almost to the exclusion of the other two legs of the stool here. In 2019, the state came together on the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was the first broad-scale energy legislation that had been passed in a few decades in New York. It really put a heavy focus on cutting GHG, greenhouse gas levels, GHGs. You'll see cutting by 40% by 2030 and at least 85% by 2050. And the actual goal is 100%, but there are allowable offsets that could bring it back to 15%. The offsets, however, are really limited and very hard to use. So it's interesting. Among the options for offsets are things like reforestation, carbon capture, ecosystem restoration. Part of the language from the legislation on the offsets is, and I'm going to read this to get it right, is the offsets shall not result in disadvantaged communities having to bear a disproportionate burden of environmental impact. So it's a very strong focus on environmental justice issues. No arguments with that, just want to make sure folks understand that that is a strong orientation of the legislation. In addition, the offsets need to be within 25 linear miles of a project using the offset. So the challenge is to try to do reforestation near a power plant that's being constructed may not be feasible at all. So it's unclear to me how many offsets will be able to be used in this process. Another focus of the legislation is just cutting electric power, greenhouse gas emissions, looking to get to 0% non-emitting by 2040, and reach 70% renewables by 2030. That's actually not so hard because we're close to 50% non-emitting right now, although we're probably at 35% in New York for renewables at this stage. And then there's a goal to increase general efficiency by 185 tera-BTUs by 2025. And to give you some context, New York State uses around 2,600 tera-BTUs of energy across all sectors right now. So the CLCPA, Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, has these very prescriptive path to achieve climate leadership goals. I'm going to talk first about the climate leadership, then I'll talk about the community protection. The law is explicit in selecting technologies rather than setting overall goals for greenhouse gas reductions. Looking at things like 6 gigawatts of distributed solar. To date, the state is counting about 2.4 gigawatts of distributed solar installed. And what's interesting is that I think that the definition of distributed solar has been changing over time since the law was passed. Distributed solar initially really meant rooftop solar, but it's really hard to reach 6,000 megawatts, 6 gigawatts of distributed solar that way. NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Agency or Authority, reports that 123,000 homes have rooftop solar at this point. Now, that's a lot of homes, but at 4 kilowatts per installation, that's still only a half a gigawatt. So to get to the other 2.4 gigawatts, they have to have larger scale installations that are being done, and that's being done as community solar projects that then anybody in the community can decide to purchase from. That's great because larger scale projects get much larger economies of scale with it. State's making progress on the storage front. At this point, about 700 megawatts or 0.7 gigawatts has been installed by the end of 2019. About half of that is grid connected storage, so it's not really looking to manage on the distribution sector. Offshore wind is the biggest component here, and at this point there's a 130 megawatt project that the Long Island Power Authority, my old agency, signed a contract for in 2017. That project is still held up in permitting issues. It's the problem is that as much as the people want it, they can't yet agree on where the transmission should come ashore. And that project is about 30 miles offshore. It's so far offshore that you can't even see it from Long Island. And that's typical of the project that New York State is going forward with at this point. NYSERDA has also signed contracts for 1,700 megawatts or 1.7 gigawatts of projects. They signed those in October of 2019. Permits are pending on that. Not clear when those permits are going to be available. The target was to have these projects available by 2021. I'm dubious on that. NYSERDA recently put out an RFP for another 2.5 gigawatts or 2,500 megawatts. So putting those two pieces together, when those things are installed, the 2.5 gigawatts, the 1.7 gigawatts, that puts New York halfway towards its 2035 goal under contract. So then the other part of the legislation is the community protection element. And environmental justice is a very strong emphasis of law, and that's great because environmental justice has been overlooked or been run roughshod over through much of the history of building power plants and building energy resources. Now, saying that, they have established a fairly extensive Climate Action Council, 22 members. More than half of those members come from state governments. The rest are appointed by the state legislature, the Senate Majority Leader, the Assembly Speaker, the minority leaders in both houses of the state legislature. Council has to develop a scoping plan. It has to do that in consultation with several working groups that are all looking to balance the interests of the community. Just Transition Working Group is interesting because it's looking at the question of, as fossil power plants shut down and potentially stop paying taxes, how are those communities impacted by the loss of those revenues? So these are all complicated questions, and none of them necessarily signal that energy prices will come down at all. So one of the interesting things is that New York is already a climate leader. When you take a look on a per capita basis for greenhouse gases, the only jurisdiction in the United States that emits fewer metric tons of carbon dioxide per person is the District of Columbia. And on an energy consumption basis, only Rhode Island exceeds New York in terms of energy efficiency. So New York is already a climate leader, but it has the objective of being an even bigger leader going forward. And what's impressive about New York being a leader is that New York actually has the third largest economy in the country, but it's the ninth largest GHG emitter. And interestingly, in the period from 1990 to 2016, New York, among those top 10 states, cut its emissions the most. And that's especially interesting in contrast to states like Texas and Florida, where GHG emissions have gone up. I'll just note for a moment, I use 1990 as a baseline for a lot of things. 1990 is important because that plays into a lot of the global greenhouse gas concords, especially things like the Paris Accord. So that's why 1990 appears frequently in this presentation. So New York has been, after seeing electric consumption grow pretty steadily from 1990 through 2006, New York has actually been doing a pretty good job of bringing it down. It's interesting to note here, you can see the impact of the 2008 recession in the drop in consumption in the mid 2000s. Slowly it drifted up again, but more recently, New York's renewed push on energy efficiency has been driving it down, and we're down right now. New York State is around 160,000 gigawatt hours a year of consumption. The plans for energy efficiency programs are that by 2030, New York is going to be down to 141,000 gigawatt hours. So that's an impressive drop, because that brings us back down to essentially to 1990 levels, with a population that is fairly stable, has grown somewhat, but an economy that has continued to grow from 1990 to today, and certainly some of us hope will continue to grow for the future. So looking at how New York's greenhouse gas emissions are totaled up, what I'm showing here is an inventory of the major sectors. Electricity generation, which includes the net imports, so we include the environmental aspects of any imported power to New York. Transportation, residential, commercial, industrial, and other is sort of a large slice, but it includes agriculture, waste, industrial processes. So I just wanted to put that all out there. What's interesting to see is that from 1990 to 2015, the reduction rate overall has only averaged about 1/3% per year. So that's what the dotted line is. The circles show the targets for 2030 and 2050. A 40% reduction from 1990 targets and an 85% reduction from 1990 targets. So to get there, we actually need a growth rate, a decline rate of 2.2% per year. So nearly 7 times the rate of decline that we saw in the preceding 25 years. So there's the message. New York needs to achieve a steep reduction going forward. So what has made New York such a climate leader? Urban density of the downstate region really helps. Multifamily homes, people are living in these high-rise buildings. They're generally, people live in smaller homes in these multifamily buildings. Mass transit is huge. New York has also shifted over time from a manufacturing and service, manufacturing to a service and finance economy. I was looking this up, and actually, back in the 1930s, New York was a leading manufacturer for the whole country, and that was because of its port and shipping capabilities. And back then, a lot of raw materials came into New York City, and things were manufactured actually right in New York City, or brought into the state a little bit to be manufactured before being shipped across the rest of the country. That obviously has all changed over time. New York has largely eliminated coal from its mix. That's happened at an even faster rate than the rest of the country. Now, the rest of the country, back into the almost to 2005, nearly half of the country's electricity came from coal. At this point, only 1/4 of the country's electricity is coming from coal. That is because of the shift of low price natural gas and using more efficient natural gas combined cycle generators. And finally, New York has leadership, has greenhouse gas leadership from the large volume of non-emitting resources, in particular nuclear power, which in 2015 provided 31% of the state's electricity, and hydropower, which provided 18%. So nearly half of all the electricity consumed in New York was produced by non-GHG emitting resources. So that's been great. New York has had this terrific position of being a climate leader, but now it risks starting to go backwards and missing some opportunities for further GHG reductions. In particular, nuclear power plants have started shutting down, beginning with the Indian Point 2 station that shut down in April of this year. Indian Point 3 is scheduled to shut down next year, 2021. And interestingly, in New York, as in many other states, nuclear plants are finding that they're having a hard time competing in dispatch models against natural gas. So that the only way for some of them to continue to be competitive, and New York has done this, is to introduce something called zero emissions credits, which are like renewable energy credits, but dedicated directly to nuclear plants. So these zero emissions credits, ZECs, have been put into place. They're keeping the nuclear power plants economically viable, but the ZECs in New York are scheduled to expire in 2029. And so far there hasn't been much movement on seeing the ZECs extended. I've been told that will happen, but it's probably going to be an 11th hour thing. So there's a lot of uncertainty with that, which is dangerous from a planning perspective. Just to give you an idea of what the dangers of not having clear signals far enough ahead for capacity markets, we could just look at California right now, which suddenly finds itself more than 4,000 megawatts short, which is why they've had a series of rolling blackouts across the state this week. The nuclear power plants also do have operating licenses expiring. Some of those licenses could be further extended, but there hasn't been a lot of appetite or a lot of support for that in New York. The next issue is natural gas pipelines. So I mentioned that New York, like a lot of other states, has seen coal plants shutting down, and as natural gas has been more competitive and has allowed these projects to compete against the coal plants. Now, we don't expect a lot of we're not going to convert any coal plants because we actually shut the last coal plant in New York recently. But to meet new need, we would need more gas pipelines, and gas pipelines have been vigorously opposed by New York State in particular, and New York has been very reluctant to provide any of the water permits that are necessary to allow these pipelines to proceed. This has actually resulted for a period of time in moratoria against any new gas connections, which was a problem for the business community, for people who wanted to start installing natural gas to get off burning oil to heat their buildings and their homes. And imported hydro is another opportunity for New York, but until recently, New York has resisted bringing in more hydropower from Canada. So looking at the impact of this kind of a shutdown on nuclear power, what you can see is as we shut down these nuclear plants, we have to replace the electricity from somewhere. So each time the green line is the energy coming out of the power plants. So there's been about 45,000 gigawatt hours out of nuclear. So that's that 30% that I mentioned before. But Indian Point 2 shutting down this year. Indian Point 3 shuts down in 2021. And then I've assumed that the rest of the nuclear fleet continues to operate through 2029. But if the ZECs are not extended, then they all go to zero all nuclear power production goes to zero by 2030, which means that we add 20 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, so greenhouse gas, and that pretty much wipes out the gains in GHG reductions that New York has seen over the past 25 years. So I label that in my report a counterproductive policy. So new hydro has been prohibited under regulatory policies in New York from participating as a renewable energy and has not been eligible for renewable energy credits. So it lacks this competitive edge that we're giving to solar projects in New York and that are being given to land-based and offshore wind projects. That just makes it a little bit harder to compete and more expensive. Now, recently in July of 2020, so last month, NYSERDA floated a concept of a renewable energy tier, and there are different tiers that give different amounts of credit for different technologies. But this tier, which would be a tier 4, is very targeted, specifically for hydro delivered only to New York City, because New York City has expressed an interest in bringing power down from Canada. I have a problem with that because what you're doing is introducing a new market distortion into the electric power markets and not letting resources compete as effectively as possible. As I said, the legislative history on why Canadian hydropower isn't allowed is a little bit murky. As I've researched it, some of it has to do with concern that hydro might actually be a greenhouse gas positive source. That can be true for projects developed in tropical regions, something like the Three Gorges project in China may actually generate greenhouse gases from all the organic matter that's being dissolved and emitting methane from it. There also, at the time, was a concern that some of the First Nations in Canada were not supportive of the project, and so New York sort of just took this hands-off approach. My feeling is that if Hydro-Quebec can negotiate with its First Nations population on an equitable project, then it would be great if New York could actually get the benefit of that. Another interesting current problem is that there are economic interests in New York that are opposed to seeing any new Canadian hydro come in. In particular, the Independent Power Producers of New York, which is a trade association, has been very actively campaigning against any Canadian hydro. So, and obviously that's because they want to keep their projects competitive. So a key part of the CLCPA is driving electric power emissions to zero. But that is just a start towards meeting the goal of getting to an 85% or 100% reduction in statewide greenhouse gas emissions, because at this point, electric power only represents 17% of the total inventory. So, the big pieces that really require attention are transportation, which is a third, and then if you put together commercial, residential, and industrial, that's another 30% right there. And as I said, that other category is things like agricultural. But it's easy to start putting attention on transportation and on the residential, commercial, and industrial. So to get to that goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we need to decarbonize. We need to take all the carbon out of those sectors. And the way to do that is actually to take transportation and convert it from using petroleum products to being powered by electricity, but electricity only provided by non-GHG emitting resources. So when you start to take a look at it, we're not going to touch jet fuel. We're not going to tell the airline industry that they can only fly battery-powered aircraft into JFK, but there's still 800 tera-BTUs of petroleum that needs to be replaced by electricity. So converting all that transportation into electricity is going to result in 40 to almost 50,000 additional gigawatt hours of consumption. And remember that right now, New York State's energy consumption is 160,000 gigawatt hours total, and headed towards 140,000 gigawatt hours. Now, thinking about converting all this transportation to electric means really converting, getting nearly every person who buys a new vehicle to buy an electric powered vehicle. It also requires having the infrastructure to power those cars and trucks and buses. That adds a lot of cost. When we think back to the environmental justice and the social equity issues, there's a problem there in that the car owners are, vehicle owners are generally middle class, upper middle class. The people who can afford the electric vehicles are in the upper economic spectrum. But the state is so heavily promoting electric vehicles that it's giving economic benefits to those people. So we're seeing money going to folks so they can buy $30,000 to $90,000 cars. Some serious social equity issues there. Coming to the residential and commercial loads, which is 25% of the GHG, most of that GHG impact is for space heating. And the assumption that the state is working with right now is that that space heating load could be served with heat pumps. And if we could convert it using some current efficiencies and projected reasonable improvements in efficiency, that still means the state needs another 40,000 gigawatt hours of energy. So putting together the transportation and the heating, we're looking at 90,000 gigawatt hours of additional energy against the state's projected 140,000. Heat pumps are a terrific technology in the right setting. They're good for homes in temperate climates. They don't work so well in really cold parts of the state. So when you get up to Watertown, you get up to the northern tier of the state, they don't really work well. Another problem is coming back to those high-rise buildings in New York City, a lot of them powered by steam boilers. Very hard to get the energy density necessary to convert them to electricity, and not a lot of good solutions at that point. So the question is, what are we going to use to meet the loads? And this is probably a slide that's familiar to everybody, so I don't need to go into it in great depth, but just so everybody's clear, if we try to meet that 90,000 gigawatt hours of load, we either need to add about 11 nuclear plants, or 11 gigawatts of nuclear plants, maybe 10 nukes, 21 gigawatts of offshore wind, over 40 gigawatts of land-based wind, and I didn't even do the numbers for utility scale solar, but a lot of utility scale solar. So what's this all mean? If we're looking at deep decarbonization, we convert all the transportation, or all the addressable transportation, all the heating loads that we can to electricity, it actually means that we've got to massively increase the amount of electric power production in the state, and it's all going to be done with non-emitting resources. So what's the resource mix look like going forward? What you see in this chart is that the bottom, the dark blue sector, is the existing renewables. So that's the in-state hydro, that's the imported hydro that New York already has. It's the existing wind and solar that's in the state. The next slice there, the striped blue, is a renewable pipeline that NYSERDA has, and they have contracts that take them out through 2025. Next is the nuclear power plants, and I've made an assumption here that some of these plants ramp down through 2030, but that there is one nuclear plant that continues to operate through into about 2046 with its operating license. So I've assumed that there is some resolution on the ZEC issue for that. Otherwise, there's just that much more renewable energy that needs to be added to it. The plan is for natural gas. As New York State tries to get to 100% non-emitting resources for electric power, the natural gas has to curtail over time. The last of the coal, oil, and solid waste is shown here and tailing off by 2025. A lot of the solid waste to energy projects actually are nearing the end of their original contracts. Not clear if which ones may get permitted for new contracts and new license extensions with that. So then the next slice is the build out of the wind energy projected by the CLCPA. So that's this ultimately 9 gigawatts by 2035, and the energy that we would get out of that. The green slice is the solar mandated by first to be built out by 2025 and then producing, which leaves us then with this big red slice that needs to be in place by 2040. If we just added in the same proportions of the community, the CLCPA's wind and solar, we need nearly 18 gigawatts more wind and 12 gigawatts more solar, in addition to the 9 and 6 that are already mandated. So that is a huge scaling up. So that essentially is what New York's energy plan leads us to. The state didn't map this out. This is my work. I'm pleased with this. I think this holds up well. I think it's important to recognize how much building we need to do of renewables to meet the state's goals, and recognize that these goals assume increasing energy efficiency. This incorporates the fact that overall electric consumption without these new loads gets to 140,000 from the 160 that we're at right now. So what's missing from the state's plan? No really strong price signals. The energy resources play against each other. There's some bidding among the sources. The folks who are proposing to build offshore wind have to bid against each other, but we don't see competition among the different technologies for what has the biggest bang for the buck in greenhouse gas emissions. There's no trading of emissions between sectors, so there's no saying that if I can reduce emissions by anaerobic digesters, that's a credit, and therefore I don't have to make a building more efficient. And there's not even trading within sectors. And I've heard this especially as a comment and a complaint from real estate developers in New York, which is that especially real estate developers may have a large portfolio of buildings, some very efficient buildings, some buildings that are not so efficient. And what they'd like to do is they'd like to spend their money on the buildings where they're going to get the biggest savings out of them. But New York City in particular has its own emissions reductions targets, and it sets emissions targets building by building by building. And that's not an economically efficient way to work. It's not a sensible way for these business owners to work, because they may be looking at a building that they think they're going to close in a couple of years, but they may be mandated to install these new energy efficiency measures and then shut the building down. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense. And the real problem with that further is that things like the New York City Housing Authority's stock of buildings are not included in New York City's program. And the NYSERDA buildings are among the most energy inefficient and the biggest greenhouse gas emitting per capita of any of the residential properties in the city and in the state. It'd be great if buildings could actually pay for emissions reductions in these housing authority buildings rather than installing measures that really make a nominal difference in their building. So that's part of what's missing here. So what's a policy path forward for New York? I'd love to see New York really adopt an economy-wide carbon pricing system. Now, the New York Independent System Operator has been moving towards that on the electric side with carbon pricing proceedings, and that's encouraging. But New York really should consider looking at carbon tax. Some people prefer to call it a carbon fee, or using a cap and trade mechanism. And New York has a lot of experience with cap and trade. New York is part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, REGI, which has done a terrific job of lowering greenhouse gas emissions across a 9-state region. So New England, New York, reaching down into the mid-Atlantic. Touched on looking beyond New York's borders with Canadian hydro. But one of the things I think New York is really missing out on is New York and every other state that is looking to reduce greenhouse gases is really interested in being the leader rather than being a partner with all these neighboring states. New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts are all pursuing offshore wind projects. And yet they're competing against each other to lure the offshore wind developers to their states, to try to get those developers to bring in staging areas, to bring in manufacturing, to try to get all the jobs in their state. But what's happening is the developers are smart folks, and they are playing the states off against each other and getting a lot of economic incentives from the states to locate. I think it makes a lot more sense for all these states that are pursuing offshore wind to form a buyer's consortium and then turn it back to the developers and say, okay, let's distribute the jobs and the economic benefits among the states, find an equitable way to do that, and you give us the best prices for your offshore wind energy. Touched on the benefits of nuclear power and retaining that, but already touched on avoiding the self-imposed constraints, especially with gas pipeline capacity. And I talked about transportation, but what part of the focus hasn't been enough on where New York has some of its already great advantage, which is the broad transportation, the mass transit, public transit. New York has a great mass transit system in New York City. It stretches out into the suburbs. Find ways to to expand transportation alternatives that are more energy efficient rather than just promoting electric cars across the state. Put all those things together, and I think that New York can have a terrific energy policy going forward. So I'm going to conclude where I started. Climate change is an existential crisis. Let's see if I got this right. But we need to find economic and efficient solutions to make that all happen. And with that, Frank, I'm happy to take some questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Seth. I think it's a small enough group. If you have a question, just unmute your mic and jump in. And if I need to direct traffic, I will. So let me give people a minute, but if you have a question, just make sure you unmute and go for it, and we'll see what happens.
So maybe let me hop in right away on the transportation piece. Obviously, there's been a lot of Teslas sold and everything, and you point out that that's an affluent sector. But wouldn't there be a pretty big sector in changing to electric buses? So those are bigger battery, bigger price tag maybe, but you get the added benefit in the city of reducing diesel exhaust health effects, externalities, and so it's a energy, environmental justice twofer.
Absolutely. I think that there should be a much greater emphasis on the mass transit and making mass transit as clean as possible. Now, a lot of the mass transit buses have been converted in the past 10 years to natural gas. And so I think you also have the issue of, you know, what's the turnover rate for the stock? Because if you've just made this investment in natural gas, you want to wait until you're at a replacement period for them. But I completely agree that switching to electric, and actually in New York City, what we see are also gas electric hybrid buses running. And you know, I have a soft spot for hybrids because your range is just much greater under those circumstances, and especially in times of energy disruption. You know, when we have a hurricane, when Sandy hit, if we were relying on electric buses, we would have had a lot of stranded people after 24 hours. So, I completely agree. Electrifying the buses is great. I like hybrid as a solution because I think that it gives you greater range. That means still maintaining a natural gas delivery infrastructure, and that's part of the problem. Is New York is sort of has been opposed recently to any addition to the natural gas pipeline system.
Great. Other questions?
Seth, David McGowan. I'd like to continue that theory of disruption, as I am doing this full time pretty much with the Army as a client right now, and getting to be a little bit alarmed that while lots of us have been promoting renewable energy for a long time, what happens on 12, 14, 16, 18 hours past that hurricane and it's still cloudy, the wind isn't blowing, the sun ain't shining, and the battery is depleted. I'm seeing state after state after state running away from natural gas, leading us to the very real possibility there won't be any energy. I'd love your thoughts on that. Over.
No, it's terrific. And what I didn't even get into here is I was showing annualized power production numbers for offshore wind. There are very strong seasonal components to it. Now, offshore wind actually blows more in the winter, which turns out to match well with as you decarbonize the heating system and you need more electricity there, you're actually ramping up. So maybe those two match, but you can go a day with very little wind, especially in the summertime, which still has high loads. And it's a real problem. It's why we need to maintain a natural gas infrastructure, and we need to maintain those gas-fired power plants. And we're seeing them shifting more and more to just emergency backup and being used for shorter periods of time. It actually means that the ISOs need to make sure that these projects are getting paid enough during the few hours that they run. But David, you're absolutely right to be concerned that we're so reliant on these intermittent resources that we could run into delivery problems at times.
Yeah, and for anybody that missed it, I am literally sweating bullets right now as to what's going to happen in ERCOT. Because last year when ERCOT didn't have any wind and it was a 110-degree day, we went to $9,000 a megawatt hour.
Yeah. Yep.
Other questions? Well, I have one. Seth, you mentioned the importance of price signals in your discussions and work. Is there a reason, or what is your conclusion why policymakers are so reluctant to emphasize more price signals as opposed to this item by item laundry list that New York has gone down, New Jersey, and many other states? So I'll stop there.
Well, I think that a lot of policymakers aren't sure that they trust the markets to respond, and they're also business interests that want to see particular technologies developed. The offshore wind industry wants to promote their technology. They want to see that get built. But a lot of it comes down to not trusting the industry to provide things. So New York and New Jersey have a long history of very prescriptive regulation. Rather than objective based, they become prescriptive. And the interesting thing is that for a long time, the United States had a history of objective based regulation, which just said, get this target. And I think the sulfur dioxide trading credits was a great example of that, which is, just set a price on sulfur dioxide and let folks find the most efficient method of cutting it down. New York wants to make sure that renewable energy is the solution, that it's actually built in the state or connected directly to the state. They don't, and it's interesting because this is greenhouse gas emissions. It's global greenhouse gases. The truth is, if we're cutting greenhouse gas emissions in Ohio or Iowa or Nebraska and somehow importing that power all the way into New York, that has the same global impact on greenhouse gases as something built in the offshore environment in New York State. But New York wants, they want to have things that they can see and touch themselves, I think. And I think that's part of the reason you see these very prescriptive rules. But it's also not trusting markets.
Good. Other questions or comments?
So Frank, David, again, I'm trying not to hog it, but there's a lot of silence out there.
Go ahead.
So you've got your ideas about where we might go. What could we do to nudge the needle that isn't futile? Got any ideas?
Well, I think one of the things is that, as I said, the New York ISO is pursuing carbon pricing. And I think that getting involved with that at the state level is important. Look, New York's energy policy is very much a top-down construct. And finding ways to persuade the governor's office that to consider some broader things is important. And that's a challenge. That's being politically active and politically connected. I think that talking to New York City to try to get them to understand the implications and the feasibility of some of their approaches may be part of it, but it's very hard. There are some entrenched lobbyists for industry, and the environmental groups are also strong and active, and that's part of what helped shape the policy here. It's for those of us who worry about keeping the lights on and doing it in an environmentally sensible manner at a reasonable price, we just have to keep asking these kinds of questions and saying, well, wait a second, how does that actually work? And that was one of the reasons that I actually did that slide, to put it all together, which is it's great for New York to say, well, we're gonna build this, we're gonna build that, we're gonna decarbonize everything, but the state hadn't bothered to say, oh, and by the way, it means that we've got to build this much offshore wind, and how far out is that wind going to be? How much is it going to cost? And when NYSERDA talks about the offshore wind projects, what they say is, we got great prices bid into us, better than the last tranche. But they don't really put it into a context of how that price compares to other resources that are available. And that's, again, because they segment it. And I'd rather that we were looking at the whole market. And I think that's part of the message, to keep saying to everybody, let all these resources compete. Let's find the biggest bang for the buck in greenhouse gas reductions and go after those things.
Good. Other questions? All right. Well, I'm assuming, Seth, people can contact you directly.
Yep.
And if they have your email address at the end, and we'll post this with your final approval. But thank you very much, Seth. Thank everyone for joining us. We have another presentation, a student presentation tomorrow at 10 a.m. on the impact of COVID on transportation in New York City. And then Kevin's been emailing out his keys of REI, our list. So I think we have 5 or 6 coming up over the next semester and more to come. I think that's roughly correct. But with that, thank you again, Seth. Thank you, everyone. And hopefully we'll see you at our next presentation. So thank you.
Right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.